Okay, chapter 22. This is the beginning of Progressive Era. There's going to be two chapters that go over the Progressive Era, which is going to begin about 1900. Gilded Age was everything leading up to Progressive Era, what we covered in the last unit. And then this is going to be addressing a lot of the problems that came from the Gilded Age and pretty much characterized by changes and reforms, addressing business, way people live, all the above. All right, so industry. This industrialism, immigration, and urban expansion were major elements that the U.S. was experiencing at this point. Industrial growth meant more goods at lower prices, and mass production was the key for more industrial growth. Industries were employing thousands of workers using assembly lines. Social problems from the 1890s still lasting. Millions were suffering from poverty, from disease. Racism was still a severe problem. Hostility towards immigrants. 1 out of 7 is foreign-born in 1900. Economic condition was improved for a lot of people, and one of the ways they did that is with better jobs, with better workplaces, more stable income. Technology and enterprise were changing, movies, democracy, immigration, all of it. Economic condition was improving. Middle class was doing pretty well, pretty decent standard of living. It's just the low-wage earners that were still suffering a bit. Henry Ford transforms the auto industry with mass production. The assembly line technique for Ford set up a moving assembly line, 1913. Who went from making 4 cars in 1895 to 5 million by 1917. He made a smaller profit on a larger scale, so he cut down the cost of each car individually, which meant more people could buy them. So instead of just selling a few thousand in the year, he was going to sell, closer to 1 million and therefore make more money overall. And by decreasing the cost for each one of them, he was able to democratize it and allow more people and more groups of people to purchase automobiles. 1908, the Model T was introduced as federal government begins highway subsidies, national network of 2-lane all-weather roads. By 1914, Ford was making a car every 93 minutes. By 1925, it was a car every 10 seconds. It was a 4-cylinder engine, 20 horsepower, cost $850 at first, and then he's going to cut the cost down to a little under $300 per car. Trusts were still a major problem. Trend toward big business and industry accelerates, and trusts are the way to make a bunch of money quickly. 1904, trusts are going to control about 40% of American business. Standard Oil, Rockefeller controls 85% of the oil business. A lot of mergers. 6 companies control the railroads. It's an oligopoly, a control of a commodity by a small number of large and powerful companies. And so companies were starting to expand, and 1% of companies were producing about 50% of the goods. Bankers were using interlocking directorates, which is kind of like a merger but unofficial. Basically, the 2 companies have the same employees. There's just not a merger on paper. Trusts were controversial. There's a lot of debate over what should be done about them. Should they be regulated or should they be broken up? Some said they were a threat to equality, stifling individual opportunity, raising prices. Some said defending trusts said they were more efficient and a mark of the time, so we should just leave it alone. Frederick Taylor on management. Management focused on efficiency, not working conditions or workers' rights. Frederick Taylor advocated scientific management to increase efficiency. He used a stopwatch to time the output of factory workers, discovered ways to organize people. Later on, people through government would make things more efficient as well. Management focusing on speed and production. Business became large scale, mechanized, managed on a much larger scale. Workplaces were becoming more systematic, and Taylor said management must take responsibility for job-related knowledge, and management should control the workplace, standardizing methods, standardizing procedures for when people come to work. The worker welfare, as a result of efficiency in production, was not as well as it could have been, and not as higher quality. People were getting better paychecks because the more you work, the more you get paid. But there was an increased danger and tedium to the job. They were monotonous and dangerous. Machines and assembly lines sped up. Boredom, miscalculation led to disaster. Meat cutters slicing off fingers and hands. Having accidents was common. One mill had 46 deaths in 1906. And then one of the prime examples of workplace danger was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where focused on the national attention on the men and women who tried to escape a fire, but most of the exits were closed and locked to keep out thieves and protesters. Many died in the stampede. 146 total died in the event. 8,000 people will march in a funeral procession. Some people avoided getting burned by jumping. And so that's going to really lead to a big protest on factory conditions, a lot of that led by the Women's Trade Union League. In the workplace, a lot more women were working. There's about 5 million women. 20% of all women had service jobs. Married women were expected to quit. Critics say they were risking their fertility by working. A third of the ages of 14 to 24 were working. A third of married women were working. More women than men are graduating from high school, but were expected to resign when married and when they were in the business world. And a fourth of all medical school graduates were women, so some of them are getting higher education. A side note on other working conditions for the farm, I know you covered this in your homework, but just some better times on the farm. By 1920, fewer than a third of Americans lived on farms, and there's a lot of improvements, including delivery, parcel post, costs, but farm tenancy was increasing, especially in the South. Eastern farmers were gaining greater access to international markets. Western farmers are benefiting from irrigation projects. Tenant farmers were still impoverished, but overall, the majority of the other farmers were doing much better, importing water, irrigation projects. California had 42 million acres under irrigation, so there is some improvement for people that are farmers, but still a lot of the focus is going to be on industry. Children that were working, 3 million children were working. 20% of those were between the ages of 5 and 15 working full-time or almost full-time. And full-time at this point is not 40 hours, but closer to 60 or more. 25,000 were under the age of 16 and working in mines. Mostly girls were working that were under the age of 12 would work in a cotton mill. Women's Trade Union League investigated. Children's Bureau sought the need for maternal and infant health care. So one of the things that Congress will pass in 1921 was a law to protect pregnant workers and their infants' health. That was the Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Protection Act, funding maternity and pediatric clinics. All right, Niagara Movement and the NAACP. Du Bois and others reject the accommodation to racist society. At Niagara Falls Movement, they pledged action in the matters of voting, equal access to economic opportunity, integration, equality before the law. The Niagara Movement demanding immediate respect and equal rights for everybody, rejecting Booker T's more gradual approach on getting a practical education, and step by step working your way towards social equality. Du Bois and the NAACP were more on advocating civil rights and working towards that as quickly as possible. NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was formed and became one of the most important civil rights organizations. Overturned the grandfather clause for voting, required segregating housing laws, or overturned the segregating housing laws, and so they were making some advancements little bit by little bit. Black workers were still gaining the least from prosperity, whether they were a tenant farmer or in the mine or mills and mines. They had poor job opportunities and segregation, a lot of race riots. They worked on cotton farms, railroad camps, sawmills, mines. There's a lot of discrimination in pay, even in children's pay. In South Carolina, a white child would make about $14 a year, whereas a black child would make a little over $1 a year for the same job. Immigrants were still pouring in. 1901 to 1920 was a new rush of immigrants, Mexicans and Asians to the labor force, about 14.5 million immigrants. Continuing the trend of the South and Eastern Europeans, the new immigrants were met with a lot with hostility. The labor agents, or padroni, Italians, Greeks, would recruit the workers, take a cut, kind of like the political machines. Many immigrants would travel back and forth between their home countries and the U.S. to work, known as births of passage. And there were a lot of programs to start to Americanize because non-English speakers were considered a social problem. Ford actually had a school to teach English. First thing you learned was, I am a good American. Immigration was limited from China, Japan, Mexico, South and Central Europe. And the farther we get into the progressive era, China had fewer anti-Chinese laws and hostility, lower wages. Japan, most of them stay in California and settle on farms. Mexico, a lot of them coming across the border, working in Texas, building highways, digging ditches, picking cotton. A lot of anti-Catholic and Jew groups tried to require literacy tests for immigrants. All right, in the working place, a new round of labor unrest because of the speeding up of the assembly lines, long hours, low pay. Industrial productivity was starting to fall, giving rise to strikes. Meatpacking industry in Chicago had 251 strikes in 1903. Union membership goes up. AFL is still the largest union. Samuel Gompers devoted interest to craftsmen, better wages, better conditions. No women were allowed in the AFL. Women excluded from the AFL went to the Women's Trade Union League. AFL said they were too emotional and prone to mistakes, and so the Women's Trade Union League was organized by Margaret Dyer Robbins, protected females. Uprising of 20,000 strike for the shirtwaist fire workers. New York tries to get unlocked doors and better fire escapes because of the ones that failed during the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Others excluded from the AFL go to the industrial workers of the world, organized, unskilled, and foreign-born. Motto was an injury to one is an injury to all, stressed labor solidarity, urging social revolution, leading to major strikes, somewhat feared group of people. Oh, I forgot one. Mosky was one. Mosky Mills modeled paternalistic approach to labor management, expecting loyalty and viewing their employees as children. Company hired whole families, chain migration as it was known, and benefits included playgrounds, health care, home buying plans, recreation, cooking school, dental school, baseball teams, Christmas parties, just a lot of extra perks for joining their company. All right, in the urban culture, mass production meant mass consumption. There was a growing middle class, more people becoming doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers. A lot of Americans were experiencing this abundance of comfortable incomes that would allow them to spend money as consumers. They had new advertising techniques to create a demand for goods. Ads, billboards for cars, cigarettes, perfume, cosmetics, production for the clothing industry, standardizing size. Goods increase the U.S. standard of living. The wealthy increasingly are concentrated. 1900, people were making about $418 a year. By 1920, it was up to about $1,300 per year. 5% had a fourth of all income. By 1920, less than a third of the population is living in the rural areas. The cities are taking on a more modern form. Life expectancy is going up. Medical advances and better living conditions. Skyscrapers, department stores, warehouses, hotels becoming a big part of the cities. And so they start to zone off with regulations to separate industrial, commercial, and residential areas. Skyscrapers out of factory districts, factories out of the suburbs, even segregating minority groups and groups of immigrants. Popular pastimes during this time period as people start to have more leisure time. 1890, the average work week was about 60-hour work week. By 1920, it's going down to about 51 hours, and some people have more time at home. Spectator pastimes, baseball, football, movies, concerts. The NCAA, 1910. By 1910, there was about 10,000 movie theaters. Admissions was about 5 cents. One of the more popular movies at the time was Birth of a Nation, a very racist film about the KKK, seeing them as white knights. Popular music, Sousa marches, ragtime, blues, jazz, vaudeville. Vaudeville was, skits and songs, comics, acrobatics, magicians. Russian immigrant began to compose music. Irving Berlin. If you've ever heard the song White Christmas, you've heard Irving Berlin. New kinds of novels. Anne of Green Gables was written. New romance novels, detective novels, science fiction. In the arts, they start to kind of change and experiment with subjects within the arts. Dance, Isadora Duncan transformed dance, moving away from ballet, stressing to improve emotion and human form. Poetry with T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, capturing fleeting images and outbursts of poetry. And painting, the Ashcan School, that was the post-impressionists, influenced by Picasso, Cezanne, Matisse, Van Gogh, and painting life as it happens rather than pretty nature scenes. Okay, and that pretty much sums up chapter 22. I had a few things on the muckrakers, and we've gone over these pretty much. Jacob Riis and more examples of their work. Ida Tarbell writing about the Standard Oil Company. Lincoln Steffens exposing corruption in the government and the shame of the cities. More on Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. We'll talk about him in the next chapter. All right, that's the end of